Hello and welcome to episode 54 of the SU Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Anna Manning, and today we're talking about giving difficult feedback. So, what is this? Well, most of you are probably familiar with it. And if you lead or manage others, chances are you've had to give difficult feedback in the past, and you're probably going to have to do it in the future. And I hesitate to say giving difficult feedback because difficult isn't uh it's a thought, right? It's an opinion. But this episode is really for you and to help you when there's feedback that you've got to give and for some reason you're going to find it difficult to do that. And that might be for a number of reasons. So the kind of feedback that I'm talking about is, and you might know this very well, you might have to do it all the time, you might have to tell someone this is wrong, or this is not what I wanted, or we're not going to pass your probation, or we're not going to renew your contract, or you didn't get the job and this is why, or the way you conducted that meeting wasn't in accordance with our values, or we have made the decision to, I'm sure you wouldn't say sack you, but that is a difficult feedback, right? You could also call this, I suppose, having difficult conversations. And it's something that, as a leader, as a manager, it is part of your role. And it needs to be done. So, what happens if you don't like it? You find it really difficult, or you think that the other person might find it really difficult. So, I coach on this fairly frequently. And so I thought it'd be a good episode to do and to share some thoughts around. I've been a manager in teams and I've had to give difficult feedback many times. And in talking to in preparing for this episode, I talked to a few people who are have been in leadership positions a lot longer than I had, and are really used to it. So, a little bit of my own take on this. I used to hate getting negative feedback. And I found it just really excruciating and really difficult. Now, I don't think that I necessarily showed that on the outside. I think it probably looked okay on the outside, but it uh, felt terrible on the inside. And I would, go over it in my mind, ruminate over it, think about it. You might have some. That might have some resonance for you. So, as we're going through today and thinking about giving difficult feedback, we're also going to be thinking about what's it like to get? What's it like to receive difficult feedback or negative feedback in your job or in your workplace? So I realized that I was very sensitive to negative feedback, even though I reflected on the bosses that I've had over the years since I kind of started in my professional career. And I thought, first, like proper boss when I was a trainee, Caroline, she was great at it. Sarah, my second boss, she was really good at it too. Anna, amazing. Dominic, really good at it, even though he had to give me loads of negative feedback. And then my last boss, David, who was just brilliant at giving difficult feedback and taking it. So I've always been in a position where it's been really sensitively and well handled, the feedback that I've been given, even though sometimes it's been difficult and it's hurt. So I think that helped me when I was giving difficult feedback because I'd seen it modeled and I'd seen it done so well, but it still hurt. And thinking about when I see this with clients and when I coach on this, because it's a fairly frequent thing that I coach on. And what I typically see when someone brings an issue to coaching, like I've got to give this feedback or I've got to have this really difficult discussion, is what can be happening is a tendency to avoid giving the feedback or to kind of fudge it or fluff it. So, and there are obviously options when you're giving difficult feedback, or maybe you could just try and avoid it completely. When I think sometimes I've probably done that in the past. And, it's a temptation because if you think I'm going to be really uncomfortable giving this feedback, and I think the other person's going to be extremely uncomfortable too, and I may have to deal with a very difficult reaction from them or whatever. You know, human behavior says you'd probably rather avoid doing that, right? But what happens if you avoid giving difficult feedback? And when I'm coaching people, that's one of the things that I try to explore with them. So if you've currently got some difficult feedback that you've got want to give or you need to give, there might be a tendency to kind of push it to the edge of your desk, or maybe have the conversation next time or next week or whatever it is. And I think usually we don't, or clients don't count the cost of doing that. So I know it's going to be difficult. I know it's going to be uncomfortable. Therefore, I kind of avoid it, or at least I push it off. And in my experience, people tend to, because it's more comfortable to do that, right? In the immediate moment, I don't have to do the uncomfortable thing, so it's better for me to just not do it. But what I often find is that there is discomfort actually associated with not doing it. There is discomfort associated with avoiding it, but we're probably not counting the cost of that. So I like to try and explore that with clients and say, okay, well, if you don't give this feedback, if you let's say you do just completely decide to ignore it and avoid it, which you can and you might. What what is the impact of that? What is the result of that for you? What is the result for your team? What's the result for your organization? And when people really get thinking about this, they're like, oh, often the result might be, that work wasn't particularly well done, but because I didn't address it, I actually just took it back and did it all myself. So maybe it's having an impact on your time. Or other members of the team are picking up the slack. So maybe it's having an impact on their time or their workload. Or maybe let's say somebody's role isn't being fulfilled or is only being fulfilled in part, then maybe it's the business or the organization that's suffering. So somewhere along the line, there is an impact of if this difficult conversation isn't had, if this feedback isn't given, and then there's like a subsequent improvement, there is an impact. And it's good to kind of think about, remember what that impact is, call to mind, like, what's the impact here? If I just avoid this or I don't do it, what happens? And the second tendency that I see, so the first tendency can be to avoid it, which I think is very human and understandable, but can be problematic. And then the second thing that I see is a tendency to sort of give the feedback, but fluff around it is what sometimes people call it, fudge it. I think I would call it. And that's like the kind of feedback where, and you might have given this kind of feedback, I probably have, and I've definitely received this kind of feedback, where you sort of tell the person what you're getting at, but you kind of soften it and you like add a lot of language around it, and maybe you dress it up a bit. And probably what happens is, because you fudged it or fluffed it, the person who you're giving the feedback to is left kind of wondering, well, okay, maybe there's something going on there, but I'm not altogether sure what. I'm probably not altogether sure what to do to fix it. And this is, I guess it's a midway point, right? Between complete avoidance and being very fair, very direct, and being very honest in giving feedback, which can be difficult to do. And sometimes when I'm coaching, I'll say, have you had this conversation already? Or, has there been a conversation? And someone will say yes. It's like, how clear do you think you were, or how clear were you with the person about, what it is that you wanted to say? And they might say, well, I sort of maybe dressed it up a bit, or maybe I fluffed it, or, maybe I fudged it a bit. And again, very understandable. You probably don't want to be in a position of, ruining someone's day, or making their life difficult, or giving them feedback that's going to hurt their feelings, right? Most people, yeah, they don't really want to do that. But at the same time, the problems associated with fudging it or fluffing it does the person then really know what to do to fix it? And do they really know that this thing that you're trying to tell them about is even really that much of a problem? Maybe, or maybe not. So maybe the impact of that is that they don't really know what to do to fix it. You're probably likely going to have to end up having the same conversation again. So you're kind of prolonging the issue, possibly. And when there's a lack of clear, when there's avoidance, or when there's a lack of um, a clear, direct piece of feedback, I went and looked at this episode, and you might know Brene Brown, who is a researcher, and she has a book called Dare to Lead. And there's quite a lot in that book about having difficult conversations and giving difficult feedback. So obviously, it's a part of leadership. And according to the research that Brene Brown's team did, when we kind of avoid or we fluff it or fudge it, it does three things. So the first thing is it diminishes trust and engagement between the person and you, the leader. And the second thing is, they say that it increases problematic behavior, including passive aggressive behavior, talking behind people's backs, pervasive back channel communication. So, like having the meeting after the meeting or having the corridor conversation. And it can increase gossip. So, that's when I might say one thing to your face and then go behind your back. And the third thing is it can decrease performance due to a lack of clarity and shared purpose. Now, I think that's probably quite obvious. But the second bit, I hadn't really thought about so much, and increasing problematic behavior. So if you're not giving direct feedback or you're avoiding it, you can increase problematic behavior, including passive aggressive, talking behind people's backs. And to be honest, I think that could be the leader, right? Because the chances are, if you're not giving some feedback or you're avoiding it, you might be saying, oh God, oh, Anna, she just can't get that right. Or, it really is a bit of a pain, or, oh, you get the picture. Rather than just saying, Anna, that piece of work was not what I needed. Here's what I need you to do to fix it. And I'm expecting that next time it's not going to come back with the same problem, right? If you've had that direct conversation with me, you probably don't feel the need to increase problematic behavior, as they call it. You probably don't feel the need to, oh, the ice cream van's going past. I don't know if you can hear that. Yeah, you probably don't feel the need to talk about it behind the back or whatever, because you're just giving that direct, fair, and honest feedback. So why is it difficult? Why do we find it difficult? And some people find giving feedback and having uncomfortable conversations a lot more difficult than others. Or it might be that you generally find it okay, but with a particular person you find it really, really difficult. Or it might be someone's in a particular situation. So maybe this person's already having a really hard time at home, right? So that having this conversation or giving this piece of direct feedback might be more difficult. So my general observation when people are really struggling to give difficult feedback is they don't want to be insensitive, and they don't want to create a reaction in the other person. So usually they care about the other person and they don't want to hurt their feelings. But the other thing that I notice is that often, if you're struggling and you're someone who finds it really difficult to give hard feedback, you may also tell me you're someone who would struggle to take that particular piece of feedback, right? So I would be someone in the past who would very much struggle to take negative feedback. I think, from my observation, I don't have any research to back this up, but I have observed that the more difficult you find to take negative feedback or criticism, the more likely it is that you're going to find it difficult to give it. So there was some interesting tips. We're going to go through and think about, all right, let's say this is you and you do find it difficult. What are some things that might help you? What are some things that might make it, I hate to say easier, because maybe it's never going to be that easy. But again, back to Brene Brown from Dare to Lead. They have a kind of checklist for giving feedback, and their checklist says, I know I'm ready to give feedback when I'm ready to sit next to you rather than across from you. I'm willing to put the problem in front of us rather than between us or sliding it toward you. I'm ready to listen, ask questions, and accept that I might not fully understand the issue. I'm ready to acknowledge what you do well instead of just picking apart your mistakes. I recognize your strengths and I know how you can use them to address your challenges. I can hold you accountable without shaming or blaming. I'm open to owning my part in this. I can genuinely thank you for your efforts rather than criticize you for your failings. I can talk about resolving the challenges, and that will lead to growth and opportunity. And I can model the vulnerability and openness that I expect to see from you. And the last one is, I'm aware of power dynamics, implicit bias, and stereotypes. So I will leave a link in the show notes to that kind of checklist. And if you're really struggling, it might help you to just go through that checklist and be like, all right, am I, according to this research in Dare to Lead, am I ready to give feedback? Can I kind of tick off these things? The thing that I would recommend is, well, the reason that I'm saying this is because most people will come to me and say, I want to get comfortable giving this feedback, which is like really difficult or really uncomfortable for me right now. And whilst that I think is a laudable aim, yep, that's what people want. They come to this session saying, I want to be comfortable giving this feedback. And I suppose you could probably, if you did a lot of work on it, get to a point where you were comfortable giving even the most atrocious feedback. However, that may take some time. And how long do you really have before you need to have this conversation with someone? How long are you going to be like, right, I will commit to doing all the work on this until I feel really comfortable giving this feedback. And then 6 months later, I give the feedback. Well, it's probably going to be completely irrelevant by then. The problems may have escalated by then. You've completely missed the boat. You can't be like going back to someone and being like, do you remember that thing that happened 6 months ago? I'm ready to talk to you about that now because I feel comfortable, right? That's just probably not realistic for most people. So I'm not always sure if that's the right aim. Getting comfortable with giving difficult feedback, is that the right aim? Or could your aim be, or at least as a starting point, could your aim be, I'm willing to do it even though I'm uncomfortable? I'm willing to give this feedback even though I'm uncomfortable. And from those three choices that I gave you earlier, so one thing you can do is avoid, one thing you can do is fudge or fluff, and the other thing you can do is give fair, direct, and honest feedback. I recommend actually thinking and making an active decision about what you want to do. So if you're avoiding, you probably haven't like actively engaged with that decision. You probably haven't thought, right, this is really uncomfortable for me, therefore I'm going to avoid it for the next 2 weeks. You probably haven't done that. It's probably just a bit of subconscious, like, God, yeah, maybe, next conversation. And again, if you're going to fudge it or fluff it, you probably haven't thought, oh, well, I'm not really ready to give very fair, honest, and direct feedback here, so I'm going to kind of fluff around it. You probably haven't actively made that decision. So, what I'm going to recommend, because thinking about it ahead of time and committing in your mind, am I going to avoid it? Am I going to fudge it or fluff it? Or am I going to give fair, direct, and honest feedback? And guess what? You get to choose. Nobody else can know what the answer should be, but you will know what your answer is or what you want your answer to be. So actually think about it and make a decision, especially if you notice that you're avoiding it or you notice that you're fluffing. Ahead of the next piece of difficult feedback you've got to give, make an active decision so your brain knows ahead of time, okay, this is what we're doing. actually have a client, and I asked her if it was okay to reference this during this podcast episode, because she used to find this really difficult, and she is self-professed now. She says, I'm very good at giving difficult feedback now. And I loved that. And she tells herself, even now when she says I'm very good at it, I was asking her about this on email because I know that it's something that we worked on together. And she says, I tell myself this is supposed to be uncomfortable. I care about people, and sometimes I know that feedback hurts. I trust myself to be sensitive when I'm delivering feedback, and I expect myself to be direct and not dress it up or avoid it. And I was like, that is amazing, because what that client has done there, what that client has decided is, this is my, like, I don't know what to call it, like standard operating procedure, or like this is my like rule, or this is my guideline for myself that I hold myself to when it comes to giving feedback. And she's really thought about this. So she says to herself, this is supposed to be uncomfortable. So first off, that prevents her from avoiding it or fluffing it, because she knows I don't need to feel absolutely fine to do this. It's okay if it's uncomfortable. And then the next bit, I care about people, and sometimes I know that feedback hurts. And that really puts her in that position of being mindful and understanding why it's difficult. It's uncomfortable for her because she cares about people, and she knows that sometimes feedback hurts. So she reminds herself of that. But then she also reminds herself of this: I trust myself to be sensitive while delivering feedback. So many times when I coach people, they'll say, I don't want to hurt their feelings. I don't want to blah, blah, blah. And that's a good aim, right? We don't want to just willy-nilly hurt people's feelings. But the thing is, the feedback that you're giving, somebody may feel negative feelings about that. They may feel sad. They may feel, got at. They may feel whatever, angry or annoyed or pissed off, right? That's all possible, regardless of how you deliver the feedback. And that's why I think this part of her like rule is so powerful, because she says, I trust myself to be sensitive while delivering feedback. Because she's like, I remember when we coached, she said, I don't want to hurt people's feelings, and maybe I would if I say the wrong thing. And then when we dove into it, it was like, it sounds like you're really sensitive and mindful of people's feelings. And she was like, yeah, I am actually. And I always am. So it was like, okay. She reminds herself, I trust myself to be sensitive while delivering feedback. So maybe you can trust yourself to do that too. And then she says, she sets the expectation. I expect myself to be direct and not to dress it up or avoid it. Brilliant. So if you struggle with giving difficult feedback, and this wasn't me, this was what this client did off her own back. Is it back off her own bat or off her own back? I've never actually known what that is. Anyway, answers on a postcard. Create one of these for yourself. So don't just leave it to how you feel in the moment or what kind of day it is. If this is something, giving feedback, that you have to do and you have to do it regularly and you struggle with it, create yourself a little, few sentences like this that you can remind yourself of. She says, this is supposed to be uncomfortable. I care about people, and sometimes feedback hurts. I trust myself to be sensitive, and I expect myself to be direct and not to dress it up or avoid it. Now, maybe one day she'll give that answer in an interview, and my God, will that sound good? Yeah. But think about that for you. What is that standard that you want to hold yourself to? What is it that you know about yourself? What is it that you trust within yourself when you're giving that feedback? And then the other thing that it's kind of useful to think about sometimes is, if you're finding feedback really difficult, what are you believing about the other person? So when I trained to be a coach, I was taught this principle from the International Coaching Federation, right? Has this principle that says people are naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. And that stuck with me. And I always hold for my clients that there's nothing wrong with them, they don't need fixing. And this person in front of me is creative, resourceful, and whole. And I say difficult things to people during coaching sessions, right? That's the kind of relationship that you have. Once you have that relationship of trust, you can say things that might, sound really difficult or might be really difficult. But because I'm always knowing that this person in front of me is creative and resourceful and whole, I can give that kind of feedback within that relationship and within that context. And I sometimes think about that when I'm coaching on a client, and I'm really like, I'm not pulling any punches, and I'm really like being very direct. So if you're struggling to give feedback, what are you thinking about the other person? Are you believing that this is a creative, resourceful, and whole individual? Are you believing that they are a competent professional? Are you believing that they are, what are you believing? Now, this is quite subtle. You probably won't notice this, and you probably won't notice unless clients never really, this kind of can throw people off a little bit, this kind of question. But sometimes what will come out is, oh, I'm believing that I'm believing that they're struggling, and I'm believing that maybe they're not that capable or whatever. So just check in. What are you believing about the person? What if you believed that they are a creative, resourceful, and, successful professional? If you believed that about them, maybe you would also believe that they are capable of hearing fair, direct, and honest feedback. But if you're believing, oh dear, they can't take it, they're quite weak, blah, blah, you might avoid it or fudge it. And, you're going to have thoughts, and maybe you've got knowledge as well of the people that you have to give feedback to. But it kind of almost diminishes someone's humanity for you to assume that they can't take it and they can't hear direct, honest feedback. And they're not, I don't want to say not worthy, but they're like not, they have to, it has to be avoided or dressed up in some way. What if you just believed that they are a robust professional, right? Maybe it might make it a bit easier for you to give that direct feedback if that's what you want to do. And the other thing that I think is useful to think about as a kind of rule of thumb, and again, this is from Brene Brown, but she actually says she got it from the 12-step program. So maybe that's like the Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or whatever it is. It says clear is kind, unclear is unkind. So sometimes we think, oh yeah, I'm being kinder by like dressing it up or, fudging it. But maybe not. I don't think so. I think clear is the kindest thing you can be. So maybe keep that in your mind. The other thing that I think is useful to do is think about building your own capacity to hear difficult feedback. So, when I said earlier in the episode, I have found that people who struggle to give difficult feedback also probably struggle to hear it. So, I think, and I know this was definitely true for me, when I grew my capacity to hear the negative feedback, it was also easier for me to give it. There is probably some great psychological explanation for this. I don't know what it is, but I've seen it to be true. So think about, if you're struggling to give difficult feedback, what is your own capacity like to hear it, and how could you work on building that? The last thing is, watch out for your self-criticism. So again, I said, what I've noticed is the more critical we are with ourselves, the more critical the person is with themselves, the more sensitive they will probably be. So this, I think, can impact you or your ability to give difficult feedback. Because I think what I've seen and what I've observed is the more sensitive you are to difficult feedback, which it stands to reason if you're being criticized all the time, albeit in your own mind, any kind of feedback that seems like criticism, so any kind of difficult conversation or negative feedback, that's going to land more that's going to land harder for you than it might be for someone who gets criticized less, probably. So if you are trying to build your own capacity for receiving difficult feedback, and if you're building your capacity to feel more comfortable delivering difficult or negative feedback, I would recommend you think about whether and how you're being criticized by yourself. Now, I hope that you're not being criticized by other people or the people around you in your workplace, but I mean, you may be. But the bit that you can control is the bit that you're doing yourself. So definitely think about that. And there are episodes to help you if you want to dive back into the recesses of the podcast. So that is all I have for you today, people. It's gone slightly over 30 minutes, which I don't usually like to do, but there you go. I have spaces for one-on-one, so private coaching clients starting with me in September 2023. If you're listening to this way after that, I'm probably still doing private coaching, and you can click the link and book a call to talk with me about your confidence and the stuff that you're challenging or the challenges that you've got at work. And if you book that call, it's a free call. We'll go over what are the challenges, what are you finding difficult, what would you like to improve, like where is your confidence now and where would you like it to be, and I'll explain the work that we'd need to do in order to get your confidence where you want it to be, and you can decide whether or not you want to work together. So that is all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I will see you again next week. Bye.